Deep in the mist-shrouded hollows of Appalachia, where cell towers have never reached and GPS signals die without warning, there existed religious movements so extreme that even seasoned investigators refused to document them. These weren't your typical mountain churches with their Sunday services and potluck dinners. These were organizations that twisted faith into something unrecognizable, something that would make rational people question whether certain knowledge should ever be preserved. In 1962, a federal agent investigating tax evasion in eastern Kentucky stumbled upon what appeared to be a routine audit of a small mountain congregation. 3 weeks later, he submitted a report so disturbing that it was immediately classified and buried in government archives. His final entry read simply, "Some forms of worship were never meant to survive civilization. What I witnessed defies not just law, but human decency itself." The agent requested immediate transfer to another state and never spoke of his findings again. What you're about to discover are the true accounts of 9 religious cults that operated in the most remote regions of the Appalachian Mountains, each more dangerous than the last. These groups didn't just challenge conventional Christianity, they perverted it into something that would have been alien to any recognized faith. Their practices were so extreme that entire communities would vanish overnight, leaving behind only cryptic symbols carved into trees and structures that defied logical explanation. The families and individuals who joined these movements didn't simply disappear from public records, they seemed to disappear from reality itself. Government investigators would arrive at locations where hundreds of people had reportedly lived, only to find empty clearings with no evidence that human habitation had ever occurred. Yet local residents would swear they had seen smoke rising from those valleys just days before, heard voices singing hymns in languages that didn't exist in any known dialect. Before we begin, I need to warn you that what follows isn't just disturbing, it's the kind of information that changes how you understand the boundaries of human belief. These weren't harmless, eccentric groups practicing alternative spirituality. These were organizations that weaponized faith, turning religious devotion into a tool for control so absolute that members would commit acts that violated every principle of civilization. The evidence for these cults comes from scattered sources, testimonies from individuals who managed to escape, reports from law enforcement officials who investigated disappearances, and occasionally, physical evidence discovered decades after the groups had vanished. What makes these accounts particularly chilling is their consistency across different time periods and locations. Independent witnesses, separated by decades and hundreds of miles, describe remarkably similar practices, suggesting that these weren't isolated incidents, but part of a broader pattern of religious extremism that flourished in Appalachia's most isolated regions. 9. The Children of the Eternal Flame operated in the remote valleys of southwestern Virginia from 1923 until their mysterious disappearance in 1941. Founded by a charismatic preacher named Ezekiel Marsh, who claimed to have received divine visions during a near-death experience in a coal mine collapse, the group established their compound in an area so isolated that it didn't appear on any official maps. Marsh taught that conventional Christianity had been corrupted by modern society, and that only through extreme purification could believers achieve true salvation. The purification process that gave the cult its name involved rituals where members would expose themselves to increasingly dangerous levels of fire and heat. Beginning with simple candle flames, initiates would progress through a series of escalating trials that tested their faith through physical endurance. Advanced members reportedly walked through bonfires without protection, held red-hot metal objects, and subjected themselves to burns that would have killed ordinary people. Marsh claimed these trials proved God's protection of the truly faithful, and that those who suffered injury simply lacked sufficient belief. What made the children of the eternal flame particularly dangerous wasn't just their self-destructive practices, but their recruitment methods. The group specifically targeted families experiencing tragedy or hardship, promising that their faith-based healing could restore lost loved ones or cure incurable diseases. Parents who had lost children were told their offspring could be returned to them through the purification process. The desperate and grieving were especially vulnerable to Marsh's promises, and entire families would abandon their homes to join the compound. Former members who escaped before the group's disappearance described living conditions that bordered on torture. Daily life revolved around increasingly extreme tests of faith, with members competing to prove their devotion through self-inflicted suffering. Children born into the cult underwent purification rituals from infancy, resulting in a generation that knew no existence beyond constant pain and religious fanaticism. Food was deliberately scarce, as hunger was considered another form of purification, and medical treatment was forbidden as a sign of weakness in faith. The group's final months were marked by what survivors called the Great Purification, a series of rituals that escalated beyond anything previously attempted. Marsh announced that God had commanded the entire community to undergo a final trial that would either elevate them to heaven or prove their unworthiness. On the night of October 31st, 1941, residents of nearby communities reported seeing an enormous fire on the mountain where the compound was located. The flames burned for 3 days, visible from towns 20 miles away. When authorities finally reached the site, they found no trace of the buildings, the people, or even the forest that had surrounded the compound. The entire area had been reduced to a perfectly circular clearing of ash and scorched earth. More disturbing still, the ash contained no recognizable remains, no bones, no metal objects, no evidence that human beings had ever been present. Geological surveys later confirmed that the fire had burned so intensely that it had actually altered the mineral composition of the soil, creating a substance that experts couldn't identify. 8. The Covenant of Sacred Suffering emerged in the mountains of eastern Tennessee during the Great Depression, preying on communities devastated by economic collapse. Led by a former Methodist minister named Jeremiah Thorne, who had been defrocked for unauthorized healing practices, the group taught that poverty and hardship were divine gifts that brought believers closer to God. Unlike other Depression-era religious movements that promised prosperity through faith, the Covenant actively sought out suffering as a path to spiritual enlightenment. Thorne's theology centered on the belief that Christ's crucifixion was not a unique sacrifice, but a template that all true believers must follow. He taught that conventional Christianity had grown weak and comfortable, and that only through experiencing genuine agony could believers understand the true meaning of salvation. The group's practices involved increasingly elaborate methods of self-inflicted suffering, always justified through carefully selected biblical passages that Thorne interpreted to support his extreme doctrines. New members underwent what the group called the trial of commitment, a ritual that tested their willingness to embrace suffering for religious purposes. The trial began with simple acts of self-denial, fasting, exposure to cold, deliberate injury to hands and feet. Those who passed the initial stages were introduced to more extreme practices that mimicked the tortures described in accounts of early Christian martyrs. The group maintained detailed records of each member's suffering, treating physical pain as a currency that could be accumulated and traded for spiritual advancement. What distinguished the Covenant from other extreme religious groups was their systematic approach to recruiting entire communities. Rather than targeting individuals, Thorne and his followers would identify towns or neighborhoods where economic desperation had created conditions ripe for religious conversion. They would arrive offering food, shelter, and hope to families who had lost everything, gradually introducing their extreme beliefs once people had become dependent on the group's support. The Covenant's compound was designed specifically to facilitate their suffering-based worship. Buildings were constructed without heating, even in harsh mountain winters, and living spaces were deliberately cramped and uncomfortable. The centerpiece of the compound was a structure they called the Temple of Trials, where members would undergo increasingly severe tests of faith. The building was designed with multiple levels, each representing a higher degree of spiritual commitment and correspondingly more extreme forms of suffering. Children born into the Covenant were raised from birth to view pain as a normal part of religious practice. They were taught that their suffering was helping to save the souls of their family members, and that any resistance to the group's practices was a sign of spiritual weakness. Many developed permanent disabilities from repeated injuries, but these were celebrated as marks of divine favor rather than treated as abuse. The group's ultimate goal was something they called the Great Offering, a mass ritual where the entire community would undergo a final test of faith that would either transport them directly to heaven or prove their unworthiness for salvation. Unlike other cults that talked about such events without acting on them, the Covenant began serious preparations for the Great Offering in 1938, constructing specialized facilities and developing increasingly dangerous rituals. On March 15, 1939, residents of nearby communities reported hearing what sounded like hundreds of voices singing hymns from the direction of the Covenant's compound. The singing continued for 72 hours without interruption, growing louder and more intense as time passed. When authorities investigated, they found the compound completely empty, with no signs of struggle or hasty departure. Personal belongings remained in place, meals were still on tables, but every human being had vanished. The only clue to the group's fate was discovered in the Temple of Trials, where investigators found a series of symbols carved into the walls that didn't match any known religious iconography. The symbols appeared to have been carved recently, but they were arranged in patterns that suggested they had been created by multiple people working simultaneously. Most disturbing was the discovery that the symbols contained traces of human blood, not just from one person, but from dozens of different individuals. 7. The Brotherhood of the Crimson Path operated in the remote hills of West Virginia from 1934 to 1943, distinguished by their belief that traditional Christian communion was merely symbolic and that true believers must participate in literal consumption of blood and flesh. Founded by a former Catholic priest named Father Marcus Donovan, who had been excommunicated for heretical teachings, the group attracted followers who believed that conventional Christianity had lost its spiritual power through excessive civilization. Donovan's central doctrine held that the Last Supper was not a symbolic meal, but a literal instruction for ongoing worship. He taught that Jesus had commanded his disciples to consume actual blood and flesh as a means of achieving spiritual union with the divine. The group's practices began with animal sacrifices during their communion services, but quickly escalated to more extreme forms of ritual consumption that horrified even the most isolated mountain communities. The Brotherhood's recruitment methods were particularly insidious, targeting families who had recently experienced the death of a loved one. Donovan would approach grieving relatives with promises that their deceased family members could be spiritually preserved through the group's communion practices. He convinced desperate people that by participating in the Brotherhood's rituals, they could maintain an ongoing connection with their dead relatives and even gain access to their knowledge and memories. New members were required to participate in what the group called the initiation of blood, a ceremony where they would consume small amounts of animal blood mixed with wine while reciting prayers that had been altered from traditional Christian liturgy. The ritual was designed to gradually desensitize participants to the consumption of blood, preparing them for the more extreme practices that would follow. Those who showed reluctance or revulsion were subjected to intensive religious counseling, designed to break down their resistance. The Brotherhood's compound was built around a central structure they called the Sacred Table, where all of their communion services took place. The building was constructed with drainage systems that allowed for the easy disposal of blood and other organic materials, and the walls were lined with religious artwork that depicted communion scenes rendered in disturbing detail. The artwork served both as decoration and as a form of psychological conditioning, normalizing the group's extreme practices through constant visual reinforcement. As the group's practices became more extreme, they began to attract attention from law enforcement officials investigating reports of missing persons in the area. The Brotherhood's members were skilled at maintaining secrecy, but their activities eventually became impossible to hide completely. Local hunters reported finding animal remains that had been butchered in ways that suggested ritualistic rather than practical purposes, and several families reported that relatives had joined the group and then disappeared entirely. The Brotherhood's final ceremony, which they called the Ultimate Communion, was scheduled for the night of October 13th, 1943. According to surviving documents discovered years later, Donovan had convinced his followers that this ritual would allow them to achieve perfect spiritual union with Jesus Christ himself. The ceremony was to involve the entire community participating in a form of communion that would surpass anything previously attempted. On the morning of October 14th, 1943, residents of the nearest town reported that the strange singing that had been heard from the Brotherhood's compound every night for years had suddenly stopped. When a group of local men went to investigate, They found the compound completely abandoned, with no sign of where the residents had gone. The sacred table had been cleaned so thoroughly that no trace of the group's activities remained, and all personal belongings had been removed. The only evidence of the Brotherhood's final ceremony was discovered in a hidden basement beneath the sacred table that investigators had initially missed. The room contained detailed records of the group's activities, written in Donovan's meticulous handwriting, documenting every ritual performed over their 9-year existence. The final entry, dated October 13th, 1943, described preparations for the ultimate communion but ended abruptly mid-sentence, as if the writer had been interrupted while documenting the event. More disturbing than the missing people was what authorities found in the compound's storage areas. So, hidden chambers contained preserved organic materials that forensic experts were unable to identify, substances that appeared to be neither entirely animal nor entirely human in origin. The preservation methods used were so advanced that they couldn't be replicated with 1940s technology, suggesting knowledge that went far beyond anything a defrocked priest should have possessed. 6. The disciples of the Weeping Mountain established their presence in the remote highlands of North Carolina in 1929, built around the charismatic leadership of a woman known only as Mother Sorrow. Unlike other cult leaders who claimed divine inspiration, Mother Sorrow taught that she had been chosen by God to experience perpetual grief as a means of absorbing the sins of humanity. Her followers believed that by sharing in her endless mourning, they could achieve a form of salvation unavailable through conventional worship. The group's central practice involved what they called the ritual of shared grief, where members would gather in a specially constructed chamber designed to amplify sound and emotion. The chamber was built into the side of a mountain, with walls that seemed to echo and multiply any sound made within them. During these rituals, Mother Sorrow would recount detailed stories of human suffering, some historical, some biblical, and some that seemed to come from sources that couldn't be verified. As Mother Sorrow spoke, members would gradually begin to experience the emotions she described, weeping uncontrollably as if they were personally experiencing the tragedies being recounted. The group believed that this shared suffering was literally drawing sin and pain away from the outside world, making them divine instruments of redemption. Sessions could last for days, with participants becoming so emotionally exhausted that they would collapse and need to be carried from the chamber. What made the disciples particularly dangerous was their recruitment of people who were already experiencing genuine grief. The group specifically targeted individuals who had lost children, spouses, or other loved ones, convincing them that their pain could serve a higher purpose. New members were told that their personal losses were part of God's plan to prepare them for the sacred work of absorbing humanity's suffering. The compound's design reflected the group's obsession with grief and mourning. Buildings were constructed with materials that naturally created mournful sounds when wind passed through them, and the architecture was deliberately designed to evoke feelings of sadness and loss. Gardens were planted with flowers that bloomed only briefly before dying, and water features created sounds that resembled crying or moaning. Children born into the disciples were raised in an environment where happiness was considered a form of spiritual selfishness. They were taught that joy was a temporary illusion that distracted from the sacred work of suffering. and that their purpose was to eventually take on the burden of grief that their parents carried. Many developed severe psychological problems from constant exposure to ritualized mourning, but these conditions were interpreted as signs of spiritual advancement rather than mental illness. The group's practices became increasingly extreme as Mother Sorrow claimed to receive visions of greater suffering that needed to be absorbed. Members began to inflict physical pain on themselves as a way of enhancing their emotional suffering, believing that multiple forms of agony would make them more effective vessels for divine redemption. The rituals evolved to include elements of physical torture alongside the emotional manipulation, creating a cycle of abuse that trapped members in ever-deepening trauma. In 1937, the disciples announced that they had been chosen for something called the Final Sorrow, a ritual that would allow them to absorb all of humanity's suffering at once, effectively ending pain and grief for the entire world. Mother Sorrow claimed that God had revealed to her the location of a sacred site where this ultimate sacrifice could be performed, and that the entire community would need to participate to achieve the necessary spiritual power. The ritual was scheduled for the winter solstice of 1937, when the group believed the barriers between the physical and spiritual worlds would be weakest. For weeks leading up to the ceremony, members engaged in increasingly intense grief rituals, working themselves into states of emotional exhaustion that bordered on psychological breakdown. The final ritual was to take place in a natural cave system that the group had discovered high in the mountains, where they believed the earth itself would amplify their suffering. On December 21st, 1937, all 147 members of the Disciples of the Weeping Mountain entered the cave system, carrying supplies for what they believed would be a 3-day ritual. Local residents reported hearing sounds of weeping and wailing coming from the mountain that continued for exactly 72 hours before suddenly stopping. When rescue teams eventually reached the cave system, they found it completely empty, with no sign that anyone had ever been inside. The only evidence of the group's presence was a series of symbols carved into the cave walls that appeared to have been made with fingernails rather than tools. The symbols were arranged in patterns that suggested they had been created by multiple people working simultaneously, and they contained traces of organic material that forensic experts couldn't identify. Most disturbing was the discovery that the symbols seemed to continue deeper into the cave system than any human could have traveled, suggesting that the carving had been done by people who had somehow gained access to areas that were physically impossible to reach. 5. The Order of the Burning Word emerged in the mountains of eastern Kentucky during the 1920s, founded by a former seminary student named Caleb Whitmore, who claimed to have discovered hidden meanings in biblical texts that revealed the true nature of divine communication. Unlike other religious groups that relied on traditional interpretation of Scripture, the order believed that sacred texts contained literal power that could be unleashed through specific rituals involving fire and spoken word. Whitmore's central teaching was that written language itself was a form of divine technology, and that certain combinations of words and symbols could create actual changes in physical reality. He taught his followers that traditional reading was merely the surface level of textual engagement, and that true believers could learn to activate the hidden power contained within sacred writings. The group's practices involved burning specially prepared texts while reciting specific incantations that Whitmore claimed to have decoded from ancient sources. The order's recruitment methods focused on highly educated individuals who had become disillusioned with conventional religious practice. Whitmore specifically targeted teachers, librarians, and other people who worked with written language, convincing them that their expertise with texts made them ideal candidates for his advanced spiritual techniques. He promised that members would gain access to knowledge that had been hidden from humanity for centuries, and that they would develop abilities that would seem miraculous to ordinary people. New members underwent what the group called the initiation of comprehension, a ceremony where they would be required to memorize and recite increasingly complex textual passages while standing near open flames. The ritual was designed to create a mental state where the boundary between reading and experience became blurred, allowing participants to feel as if they were directly experiencing the events described in the texts they were studying. The order's compound was built around an enormous library that contained thousands of books, manuscripts, and documents that Whitmore claimed to have collected from sources around the world. The library was designed with multiple levels, each representing a higher degree of textual mastery and correspondingly more dangerous forms of fire-based ritual. The highest level contained texts that members were warned could be lethal to read without proper spiritual preparation. As members advanced through the order's hierarchy, they were taught increasingly complex rituals that involved burning different types of texts while performing specific physical movements and vocal techniques. Advanced practitioners claimed they could use these methods to predict future events, influence the behavior of people at great distances, and even alter the physical properties of objects through focused reading and burning of appropriate texts. The group's practices became more extreme as Whitmore claimed to discover new sources of textual power that required more dangerous activation methods. Members began to burn texts while standing directly in the flames, believing that physical contact with fire would enhance their ability to absorb the power contained within the words. Many suffered severe burns, but these injuries were interpreted as signs of spiritual progress rather than evidence of dangerous practices. The order's ultimate goal was something they called the Great Reading, a ritual where the entire community would simultaneously burn and recite from a massive collection of texts that Whitmore claimed would unlock the fundamental secrets of reality itself. He taught that this ceremony would transform all participants into beings of pure knowledge, free from the limitations of physical existence and capable of reshaping the world through the power of language. Preparations for the Great Reading began in 1931, with members spending months memorizing thousands of pages of text and gathering materials for what was planned to be the largest fire ritual in the group's history. The ceremony was scheduled for the night of the summer solstice, when Whitmore believed the natural world would be most receptive to the transformative power of burning words. On June 21st, 1931, residents of nearby communities reported seeing an enormous fire on the mountain where the order's compound was located. The flames appeared to burn in patterns that resembled written text, and witnesses claimed they could hear voices reciting in languages that didn't sound like any known human speech. The fire burned for exactly 12 hours before suddenly extinguishing, leaving behind a silence so complete that it seemed to absorb sound rather than merely lacking it. When authorities investigated the site, they found that the entire compound had been reduced to ash, but the ash itself was unlike anything they had ever seen. Instead of the gray residue typically left by fire, the remains were pure white and seemed to glow with their own light. More disturbing still, the ash was arranged in patterns that resembled written text, as if the fire had somehow preserved the words that had been burned within it. The ash contained traces of ink and paper, but also organic compounds that forensic experts couldn't identify, substances that appeared to be neither entirely human nor entirely plant-based in origin. Most disturbing was the discovery that when samples of the ash were exposed to moisture, they would briefly reform into recognizable letters and words before dissolving completely. The letters appeared to be from multiple languages, some of which linguists couldn't identify, despite extensive research. 4. The Congregation of the Hollow Voice established their presence in the remote valleys of southwestern Pennsylvania in 1925, founded by a former coal miner named Isaiah Blackwood, who claimed to have received divine revelations while trapped underground during a mine collapse. Unlike other religious leaders who spoke of hearing God's voice, Blackwood taught that true divine communication came through the absence of sound, through sacred silence so profound that it could reveal the hidden truths of existence. Blackwood's theology centered on the belief that human speech was a corruption of pure spiritual communication, and that only by achieving perfect silence could believers access the divine realm. He taught his followers that the constant noise of modern civilization was deliberately designed to prevent people from hearing God's true message, and that salvation required the complete elimination of all unnecessary sound from their lives. The group's practices involved increasingly extreme forms of silence-based worship that went far beyond simple meditation or quiet prayer. Members were required to undergo what the congregation called the purification of voice, a gradual process where they would eliminate different types of speech from their daily lives. The process began with the abandonment of casual conversation, progressed through the elimination of prayer spoken aloud, and culminated in complete vocal silence that could last for months at a time. New members were attracted to the congregation through Blackwood's promise that silence could cure both physical and spiritual ailments that conventional medicine couldn't address. He specifically targeted individuals who suffered from hearing problems, speech impediments, or other communication-related disabilities, convincing them that their conditions were actually signs of spiritual advancement that prepared them for higher forms of divine communication. The congregation's compound was designed specifically to facilitate their silence-based practices. Buildings were constructed with materials that absorbed sound rather than reflecting it, creating an environment so quiet that members reported being able to hear their own heartbeats and blood circulation. The architecture included specially designed chambers where the absence of sound was so complete that extended exposure could cause psychological disorientation in unprepared individuals. As members advanced through the congregation's hierarchy, they were introduced to increasingly extreme forms of silence practice that involved not just the elimination of speech, but the suppression of all voluntary sounds. Advanced practitioners learned to control their breathing, heartbeat, and even digestive processes to achieve states of silence so profound that they appeared to be in suspended animation. Some members reportedly maintained these states for weeks at a time, sustained only by the spiritual nourishment they claimed to receive from divine silence. The group's most disturbing practice was something they called the communion of emptiness, where members would gather in underground chambers and attempt to achieve collective silence so complete that it would create a spiritual vacuum capable of drawing divine presence into the physical world. These rituals could last for days, with participants remaining motionless and silent, while supposedly receiving direct communication from God through the absence of all earthly sound. Children born into the congregation were raised from birth in an environment where silence was considered the highest form of spiritual expression. They were taught to communicate through subtle gestures and facial expressions, and many never learned to speak at all. Those who did develop speech were considered spiritually inferior and were subjected to intensive silence training designed to suppress their vocal abilities. The congregation's ultimate goal was something they called the Great Silence, a ritual where the entire community would achieve simultaneous, perfect silence, creating a spiritual void so profound that it would allow them to transcend physical existence entirely. Blackwood taught that this ceremony would transform all participants into beings of pure spirit, free from the limitations of material reality and capable of existing in perfect communion with the divine. Preparations for the Great Silence began in 1933, with members spending months in increasingly intensive silence practices that pushed the boundaries of human endurance. The ritual was scheduled for the darkest night of winter, when Blackwood believed the natural world would be most receptive to the transformative power of absolute quiet. On December 21st, 1933, the last sounds ever heard from the congregation's compound were the footsteps of members walking to their assigned positions for the Great Silence. Local residents reported that the usual nighttime sounds of the forest, insects, nocturnal animals, wind through trees, suddenly stopped in a radius of several miles around the compound, as if the ritual had somehow drawn all sound out of the environment. When authorities investigated 3 days later, they found the compound completely empty, with no sign of struggle or hasty departure. More disturbing than the missing people was the discovery that the silence had become permanent. The entire area remained acoustically dead, with sounds seeming to be absorbed rather than echoing naturally. Investigators reported that their own voices sounded muffled and distant, and that electronic equipment malfunctioned in ways that suggested the fundamental properties of sound transmission had been altered. 3. The Fellowship of the Crimson Dawn operated in the highlands of northern Georgia from 1928 to 1936, distinguished by their belief that the second coming of Christ could be accelerated through the systematic spilling of blood from true believers. Founded by a former Baptist minister named Reverend Matthias Kane, who had been expelled from his denomination for heretical teachings about blood sacrifice, the group attracted followers who believed that conventional Christianity had become too passive and civilized to achieve true spiritual transformation. Kane's central doctrine held that Christ's crucifixion was not a completed sacrifice, but the first step in an ongoing process that required continued blood offerings from his followers. He taught that every drop of blood willingly shed by a believer brought the world closer to the final judgment, and that those who participated in these sacrifices would be granted special status in the coming kingdom of God. The fellowship's practices began with simple rituals where members would make small cuts on their hands or arms while reciting prayers, collecting the blood in specially consecrated vessels that were believed to have sacred properties. These initial ceremonies were designed to gradually accustom participants to the sight and smell of blood, preparing them for the more extreme practices that would follow as they advanced through the group's hierarchy. New members were recruited through Cain's promise that blood sacrifice could provide healing and protection that conventional prayer couldn't achieve. He specifically targeted families who had experienced recent tragedies or illnesses, convincing them that their suffering was a sign that God was calling them to participate in the sacred work of blood offering. The desperate and grieving were particularly susceptible to his claims that their loved ones' deaths could be given meaning through participation in the fellowship's rituals. The fellowship's compound was built around a central structure they called the Altar of Renewal, where all of their blood-based ceremonies took place. The building was designed with drainage systems that could handle large quantities of liquid, and the walls were painted with symbols that Cain claimed were biblical references to blood sacrifice. The altar itself was a massive stone table that had been carved with channels to direct the flow of blood into collection vessels arranged around its perimeter. As the group's practices became more extreme, members began to compete with each other to demonstrate their spiritual devotion through increasingly severe forms of self-inflicted bloodletting. What had begun as minor cuts evolved into elaborate rituals where participants would open major blood vessels while their fellow believers chanted prayers and collected the flowing blood in ceremonial containers. The fellowship's recruitment methods became more aggressive as Cain claimed to receive visions indicating that the second coming was imminent and that more blood sacrifices were urgently needed. The group began to target entire communities using a combination of religious appeals and social pressure to convince people that their participation in blood rituals was essential for their eternal salvation. Children born into the fellowship were raised to view blood sacrifice as a normal part of religious practice, undergoing their first bloodletting ceremonies before they were old enough to understand the implications. Many developed severe anemia and other health problems from repeated blood loss, but these conditions were interpreted as signs of spiritual advancement rather than evidence of abuse. The group's ultimate goal was something they called the final offering, a mass blood sacrifice where the entire community would participate in a ritual so massive that it would provide the spiritual energy necessary to trigger the second coming immediately. Cain taught that this ceremony would result in the transformation of all participants into angels, granting them immortality and the power to judge the unworthy. Preparations for the final offering began in 1935, with members spending months preparing their bodies through fasting and purification rituals designed to make their blood as spiritually potent as possible. The ceremony was scheduled for Easter Sunday of 1936, when Cain believed the symbolic connection to Christ's resurrection would amplify the power of their sacrifice. On April 12, 1936, residents of nearby communities reported seeing a red glow emanating from the fellowship's compound that continued throughout the night. The light appeared to pulse in rhythm, as if synchronized with some massive heartbeat, and witnesses claimed they could hear voices singing hymns that seemed to come from underground. By dawn, the glow had faded, and the compound had fallen completely silent. When authorities investigated, they found the compound abandoned, with no trace of the 200-plus members who had been living there. The altar of renewal showed signs of recent use. The stone surface was stained with what appeared to be large quantities of blood, and the drainage channels were still wet with organic material that forensic experts couldn't fully identify. More disturbing was the discovery that the blood had been arranged in patterns that resembled religious symbols, as if the final ceremony had involved precise choreography rather than random violence. The only clue to the fellowship's fate was found in Cain's personal quarters, where investigators discovered a journal documenting the group's activities over their 8-year existence. The final entry, dated April the 12th, 1936, described the beginning of the final offering, but ended abruptly with the words, "The door's opening. We see the light. We are becoming." The sentence was never completed, and the handwriting deteriorated into illegible scrawls that looked more like symbols than letters. 2. The Covenant of the Undying Flame emerged in the remote mountains of eastern West Virginia in 1930, founded by a former coal company chaplain named Father Dominic Ashworth, who claimed to have discovered biblical passages that revealed the true nature of hell and humanity's relationship to eternal fire. Unlike other religious groups that viewed hell as a place of punishment, the Covenant taught that hellfire was actually a form of divine energy that could be harnessed by true believers to achieve spiritual transformation and physical immortality. Ashworth's theology was based on his interpretation of biblical passages describing the lake of fire, which he claimed were not warnings about damnation, but instructions for advanced spiritual practice. He taught that hell was not a place of punishment, but a source of power that had been misunderstood by conventional Christianity, and that properly trained believers could learn to channel hellfire for their own spiritual advancement. The group's practices involved increasingly dangerous rituals where members would expose themselves to fire while reciting prayers that Ashworth claimed were derived from ancient texts predating the Bible. These ceremonies began with simple candle lighting rituals, but quickly escalated to more extreme forms of fire-based worship that required participants to demonstrate their faith through direct contact with flames. New members were attracted to the covenant through Ashworth's promise that fire rituals could provide healing from incurable diseases and protection from death itself. He specifically targeted individuals who were facing terminal illnesses or had recently lost loved ones, convincing them that conventional medicine and traditional religion were inadequate to address their needs. The desperate and dying were particularly vulnerable to his claims that hellfire could grant literal immortality to those with sufficient faith. The Covenant's compound was designed around a central structure they called the Temple of Eternal Fire, where all of their fire-based ceremonies took place. The building was constructed with materials that could withstand extreme heat, and the interior was designed with multiple levels representing different degrees of spiritual advancement. The highest level contained a chamber where advanced members would undergo the most dangerous fire rituals, surrounded by walls that had been blackened by repeated exposure to intense flames. As members advanced through the Covenant's hierarchy, they were taught increasingly complex fire rituals that required them to maintain physical contact with flames for extended periods. Advanced practitioners claimed they could walk through fire without injury, hold red-hot metal objects, and even sleep surrounded by burning materials. Those who suffered burns were told that their injuries were signs of insufficient faith rather than evidence of dangerous practices. The group's most extreme practice was something they called the baptism of hellfire, where members would undergo a ritual that involved complete immersion in flames while reciting prayers that Ashworth claimed would transform their physical bodies into vessels capable of containing divine fire. The ceremony was presented as the ultimate test of faith, with participants believing that successful completion would grant them immortality and supernatural powers. Children born into the covenant were raised in an environment where fire was considered a sacred element rather than a danger. They were taught to handle flames from an early age, and many developed severe scarring from repeated exposure to burning materials. These injuries were celebrated as marks of divine favor, and children who showed fear of fire were subjected to intensive conditioning designed to eliminate their natural survival instincts. The Covenant's ultimate goal was something they called the Great Conflagration, a ritual where the entire community would simultaneously achieve perfect union with hellfire, transforming them into beings of pure flame who could exist eternally without the limitations of physical bodies. Ashworth taught that this ceremony would allow all participants to transcend death and become immortal servants of God's true fire. Preparations for the Great Conflagration began in 1937, with members spending months conditioning their bodies through increasingly intense fire rituals that pushed the boundaries of human endurance. The ceremony was scheduled for the night of the summer solstice, when Ashworth believed the natural world would be most receptive to the transformative power of divine fire. On June 21st, 1937, residents of communities within a 50-mile radius reported seeing a pillar of fire rising from the mountains where the Covenant's compound was located. The flames reached hundreds of feet into the sky and burned with colors that witnesses described as unlike anything in normal fire: deep purples, brilliant whites, and shades of red that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. The fire burned continuously for 7 days and 7 nights before suddenly extinguishing, leaving behind a silence so complete that it seemed to absorb sound itself. When authorities finally reached the site, they found that the entire compound had been reduced to a substance that wasn't quite ash and wasn't quite glass, a crystalline material that seemed to capture and reflect light in impossible ways. The substance was warm to the touch, despite the fire having been extinguished for days, and it emitted a faint glow that was visible only in complete darkness. More disturbing still, the crystalline remains were arranged in patterns that resembled human figures, as if the final ceremony had somehow preserved the shapes of the participants, even as it transformed their physical substance into something entirely different. 1. The assembly of the 13th hour represented perhaps the most terrifying culmination of Appalachian cult extremism, operating in the borderlands between Kentucky and Virginia from 1931 until their final gathering in 1944. Founded by a mysterious figure known only as the Timekeeper, whose real identity was never established despite extensive investigation, the assembly differed from other cults in their obsession with temporal manipulation and their belief that conventional time itself was a prison designed to prevent humanity from accessing divine consciousness. The Timekeeper's central teaching was that linear time was an illusion created by demonic forces to trap human souls in endless cycles of birth, suffering, and death. He claimed to have discovered methods for breaking free from temporal constraints, allowing true believers to experience past, present, and future simultaneously. Unlike other cult leaders who promised spiritual rewards in an afterlife, the Timekeeper offered immediate transcendence of time itself, promising followers that they could witness the creation of the world, observe their own deaths, and participate in the final judgment all at once. The assembly's practices involved rituals designed to disrupt members' perception of time through a combination of sensory deprivation, sleep manipulation, and psychological conditioning. New recruits underwent what the group called the temporal initiation, where they would be placed in specially constructed chambers with no windows, clocks, or other time indicators. Participants would be kept in these chambers for periods ranging from days to weeks, with meals and interactions provided at irregular intervals, designed to completely disorient their internal sense of time. The recruitment methods employed by the assembly were particularly sophisticated, targeting individuals who worked in professions requiring precise timekeeping: railroad employees, factory workers, and telegraph operators. The Timekeeper convinced these people that their intimate familiarity with mechanical time made them ideal candidates for learning to transcend it. He promised that members would develop the ability to predict train schedules, factory accidents, and communication failures with supernatural accuracy, making them valuable to their employers while secretly serving the assembly's higher purposes. The compound constructed by the assembly was a marvel of deliberate temporal confusion. Buildings were designed with corridors that seemed to lead in circles, rooms that appeared different sizes depending on the time of day, and staircases that somehow had different numbers of steps when ascending versus descending. The architecture was intended to create a physical environment where normal spatial and temporal relationships broke down, preparing members for the more extreme psychological manipulations that would follow. Central to the compound was a structure the assembly called the Chamber of Hours, where their most advanced rituals took place. The chamber was constructed as a perfect circle with 13 alcoves arranged around its perimeter, each containing a different type of clockwork mechanism. Some of the devices appeared to be conventional timepieces, while others were bizarre contraptions that seemed to measure time in ways that defied logical explanation. The chamber's walls were covered with symbols that the Timekeeper claimed represented different aspects of temporal reality, and the floor was marked with a complex pattern that supposedly mapped the flow of time itself. Members who advanced through the assembly's hierarchy reported experiencing increasingly disturbing temporal anomalies. They claimed to have memories of events that hadn't yet occurred, conversations with people who had died years earlier, and the ability to observe their own actions from multiple time periods simultaneously. These experiences were celebrated as signs of spiritual progress, but they also led to severe psychological breakdown in many participants who could no longer distinguish between past, present, and future. The assembly's children were raised in an environment where conventional time had no meaning. They were not taught to read clocks or calendars, and their daily activities were structured around rituals rather than regular schedules. Many developed severe learning disabilities and social problems from their inability to function in a time-based society, but these conditions were interpreted as evidence of their advanced spiritual development rather than as signs of abuse. The group's most dangerous practice was something they called the convergence ritual, where multiple members would attempt to synchronize their temporal experiences and observe the same events from different time periods simultaneously. These ceremonies could last for days, with participants remaining motionless while supposedly witnessing historical events, future catastrophes, and religious revelations all at once. Some members emerged from these rituals with knowledge they couldn't possibly have acquired through normal means, while others suffered complete psychological collapse. As the assembly's practices became more extreme, they began to attract attention from government officials who were investigating reports of missing persons and unusual activities in the region. The group's ability to predict certain events with uncanny accuracy had made them valuable to some local authorities, but their growing influence and increasingly bizarre behavior eventually raised suspicions about their true nature and intentions. The timekeeper's ultimate goal was something he called the Great Synchronization, a ritual where the entire assembly would simultaneously transcend time and witness the complete history of creation from beginning to end. He taught that this ceremony would allow all participants to become temporal beings like himself, free from the constraints of linear existence and capable of moving through time at will. The ritual would supposedly require precise coordination between all members, creating a temporal vortex that would tear open the barriers between past, present, and future. Preparations for the Great Synchronization began in 1943, with members spending months practicing increasingly complex temporal manipulation exercises designed to prepare them for the ultimate transcendence. The timekeeper claimed to have calculated the exact moment when the barriers between time periods would be weakest, and he scheduled the ritual for 11:59 p.m. on December 31st, 1943, the moment when 1 year transformed into the next. On the night of December 31st, 1943, residents of nearby communities reported experiencing the strangest phenomenon of their lives. Clocks throughout the region began to malfunction simultaneously, with some running backward, others stopping entirely, and still others racing forward at impossible speeds. The aurora borealis appeared in the southern sky, despite being geographically impossible, and witnesses claimed they could see images of historical events playing out in the colored lights, like some vast celestial motion picture. At exactly midnight, every clock within a 100-mile radius stopped at the same moment, creating a period of temporal silence that lasted for exactly 13 minutes. During this time, witnesses reported seeing figures moving through the landscape who appeared to be from different time periods: Civil War soldiers, Native Americans, pioneers, and people dressed in clothing from decades that hadn't yet occurred. The figures moved with purpose, but seemed unaware of each other as if they were occupying the same space but existing in different temporal realities. When the clocks resumed their normal function at 12:13 a.m. on January 1st, 1944, the Assembly's compound was found to be completely empty. Unlike other cult disappearances, where belongings were left behind, the compound contained no trace that anyone had ever lived there. The buildings were structurally intact, but appeared to have aged decades in a single night, with walls showing signs of weathering that would normally take years to develop. The only evidence of the Assembly's final ritual was discovered in the Chamber of Hours, where investigators found that all 13 clockwork mechanisms had stopped at different times, creating a temporal map that no expert could interpret. The symbols on the walls had somehow rearranged themselves into new patterns, and the floor markings had become so complex that they seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. Most disturbing was the discovery that the compound's temporal anomalies had become permanent. Visitors to the site reported experiencing time distortions that ranged from minor disorientation to complete temporal displacement. Some investigators claimed to have spent hours at the location, only to discover that days had passed in the outside world, while others reported the opposite experience, feeling as if they had been present for days, while only minutes had elapsed on their watches. The site was eventually sealed by federal authorities after several researchers suffered psychological breakdowns from prolonged exposure to the temporal distortions. The official explanation cited structural instability and hazardous materials, but classified documents suggest that the real reason was the discovery that the Assembly's final ritual had somehow created a permanent tear in the fabric of time itself. Local residents still report strange experiences in the area where the compound once stood. Hunters claim to encounter people from different time periods who appear lost and confused, speaking in dialects that haven't been used for generations. Hikers report finding objects that seem to age rapidly when removed from the site, crumbling to dust within hours of being taken away. Most disturbing are the reports of travelers who claim to have met members of the Assembly still wandering the mountains, unchanged by the decades that have passed, searching for their missing leader and asking what year it is. The timekeeper's fate remains unknown, but some researchers believe he achieved his goal of transcending temporal limitations. They point to reports of a mysterious figure who appears at sites of historical significance throughout Appalachia, always at moments of great importance, watching events unfold with the detached interest of someone who has already witnessed them countless times. Whether this figure is the timekeeper himself or something else entirely remains one of the most enduring mysteries of Appalachian cult history. These 9 cults represent only the documented cases of extreme religious movements that operated in the Appalachian Mountains. Government files contain references to dozens of other groups whose activities were so disturbing that all records were destroyed rather than archived. The pattern of disappearances, temporal anomalies, and reality distortions suggest that these organizations were engaged in practices that went far beyond conventional religious extremism. What makes these accounts particularly chilling is their consistency across different time periods and locations. Independent witnesses, separated by decades and hundreds of miles, describe remarkably similar phenomena. Mass disappearances, unexplained physical evidence, and lingering effects that persist long after the groups themselves have vanished. The suggestion that these weren't isolated incidents, but part of a broader pattern of occult activity in Appalachia raises questions about what other secrets these ancient mountains might still be hiding. The federal government's response to these incidents has been consistent: immediate classification of evidence, relocation of investigators, and official denials that any unusual activities occurred. This pattern of suppression suggests that authorities discovered something so disturbing that they believed public knowledge would be more dangerous than continued secrecy. The fact that these cover-ups have been maintained for decades indicates that whatever these cults were doing had implications that extended far beyond their immediate victims. Modern researchers, attempting to investigate these incidents, find themselves facing obstacles that go beyond normal bureaucratic resistance. Documents disappear from archives, witnesses refuse to speak, and investigation sites become mysteriously inaccessible. Some investigators report experiencing psychological effects similar to those described in the original cult accounts: temporal disorientation, disturbing visions, and the feeling of being watched by unseen observers. The technology and knowledge displayed by these cults also raises disturbing questions about the sources of their power. The preservation techniques used by the Brotherhood of the Crimson Path, the architectural impossibilities of the assembly of the 13th hour, and the reality-altering effects achieved by several groups suggest access to information that shouldn't have been available to rural religious movements in the early 20th century. The possibility that these groups were in contact with outside sources, whether human or otherwise, adds another layer of mystery to their activities. Perhaps most troubling is the evidence that these cults' effects have not faded with time. The sites where they operated continue to exhibit anomalous properties decades after their disappearance, suggesting that their final rituals created permanent changes to the physical world. The temporal distortions around the assembly's compound, the acoustic dead zones left by the congregation of the Hollow Voice, and the crystalline remains of the covenant of the undying flame all indicate that these groups achieved their goals of transcending normal reality, just not in the way they intended. The question that haunts researchers is whether these cults truly disappeared or simply transcended into forms that we can no longer recognize or detect. The consistent reports of strange encounters in former cult territories, the persistence of reality distortions, and the continued government interest in these decades-old cases suggest that the story of Appalachian cult activity is far from over. Whatever these groups discovered or unleashed in the isolated mountains of the eastern United States may still be active, waiting for the right conditions to emerge once again. The implications of these 9 cults extend far beyond their immediate victims or the communities they terrorized. Each group's disappearance created ripple effects that continue to influence the region today, leaving behind questions that challenge our understanding of reality itself. The patterns of government suppression, the consistency of witness testimony across decades, and the persistent anomalies at former cult sites suggest that these organizations unlocked something that conventional science and religion cannot adequately explain. What emerges from studying these cases is a disturbing picture of coordinated activity that transcended individual cult boundaries. Several groups displayed knowledge and capabilities that seem impossible for isolated mountain communities in the early 20th century. The sophisticated temporal manipulation techniques of the Assembly of the 13th Hour, the advanced preservation methods used by the Brotherhood of the Crimson Path, and the reality-altering acoustics achieved by the Congregation of the Hollow Voice all point to sources of information that shouldn't have been available to rural religious movements. More troubling still are the documented connections between some of these groups. Government files that escaped classification reveal that at least 3 of the cults exchanged correspondence before their disappearances, suggesting a network of communication that spanned multiple states and decades. The letters, written in coded language that intelligence analysts never fully deciphered, reference shared objectives and coordinate timing for major rituals. This evidence of collaboration raises the possibility that the 9 documented cults were part of a larger movement with unified goals and methodology. The recruitment patterns displayed by these groups also suggest sophisticated understanding of psychological manipulation that went far beyond what isolated religious leaders should have possessed. Each cult targeted specific personality types and exploited particular vulnerabilities with precision that seems almost scientific in its approach. The Children of the Eternal Flame focused on families experiencing recent tragedy. The Covenant of Sacred Suffering preyed on communities devastated by economic collapse, and the Assembly of the 13th Hour recruited individuals whose professions required precise timekeeping. This systematic targeting suggests access to psychological research and manipulation techniques that were decades ahead of their time. Perhaps most disturbing is the evidence that these cults' activities created permanent changes to the physical world that continue to affect the region today. The temporal distortions around the Assembly's former compound have actually expanded over the decades, with the affected area now covering nearly 50 square miles. Local residents report increasingly frequent encounters with displaced individuals who appear to be from different time periods, and several hunting accidents have been attributed to temporal confusion that caused people to become lost in landscapes that had changed around them. The acoustic anomalies left by the Congregation of the Hollow Voice have similarly persisted and evolved. The original dead zone has spawned smaller areas of acoustic distortion throughout the region, creating pockets where sound behaves in ways that violate known physics. These zones appear and disappear without warning, and several hikers have reported becoming trapped in areas where their voices couldn't be heard even by companions standing just feet away. The crystalline remains left by the Covenant of the Undying Flame have proven to be more than just an unusual byproduct of their final ritual. The substance continues to grow, spreading slowly through the surrounding soil and rock in patterns that seem to follow underground water sources. More disturbing still, the crystalline material appears to be alive in some sense, responding to changes in temperature and electromagnetic fields in ways that suggest a form of consciousness that exists beyond conventional understanding. These ongoing anomalies have attracted the attention of researchers from multiple disciplines, but investigations are consistently hampered by bureaucratic obstacles and mysterious equipment failures. Scientists attempting to study the temporal distortions find that their instruments malfunction in ways that suggest the fundamental constants of physics are unstable in the affected areas. Acoustic researchers working on the sound anomalies report that their recording equipment captures sounds that weren't audible during the actual recordings, including voices speaking in languages that linguists cannot identify. The government's continued interest in these sites, decades after the original incidents, suggests that authorities have discovered something about these cults that goes far beyond historical curiosity. Classified budget allocations reveal ongoing funding for research projects with names like Temporal Containment Initiative and Acoustic Reality Management, indicating that the anomalies created by these groups are considered active threats rather than mere curiosities. Local law enforcement agencies have developed informal protocols for dealing with incidents related to former cult sites, including procedures for handling individuals who claim to be from different time periods and guidelines for investigating disappearances that occur near acoustic anomaly zones. These protocols are not officially documented, but their existence suggests that encounters with cult-related phenomena are far more common than public records indicate. The psychological effects experienced by investigators and visitors to these sites have also proven to be persistent and progressive. Many researchers report developing what they describe as temporal sensitivity, an uncomfortable awareness of the passage of time that makes normal daily activities difficult to navigate. Others experience acoustic displacement, where they hear sounds that don't match their visual environment, including voices from conversations that took place decades earlier. These effects appear to be contagious in some sense, spreading to family members and colleagues who have never visited the actual sites. The phenomenon suggests that exposure to cult-related anomalies creates permanent changes in human perception that can be transmitted through close contact. Several universities have quietly established support groups for researchers affected by these conditions, but the existence of such programs is not publicly acknowledged. The most disturbing aspect of these ongoing effects is their apparent acceleration. Reports of anomalous encounters have increased dramatically over the past decade, with incidents occurring at sites that showed no previous signs of unusual activity. This expansion suggests that whatever these cults unleashed is not contained to their original locations, but is spreading throughout the Appalachian region according to some unknown pattern or schedule. Recent satellite imagery has revealed geometric patterns in forest growth and geological formations that align with the locations of former cult sites, creating a network of connections that spans multiple states. These patterns are not visible from ground level, but form clear geometric shapes when viewed from above, suggesting that the cult's activities created changes that extend far beyond their immediate physical locations. The implications of this discovery have led to increased government surveillance of the entire Appalachian region, with monitoring stations established at key points throughout the mountain range. The official explanation for these installations cites earthquake monitoring and environmental research, but their placement corresponds exactly to the geometric patterns revealed by satellite analysis. Intelligence agencies have also begun tracking individuals who demonstrate unusual knowledge or abilities that might be connected to cult activities. This surveillance includes monitoring genealogical records to identify descendants of cult members, tracking academic research into related topics and investigating reports of individuals who display temporal sensitivity or other anomalous conditions. The scope of this monitoring suggests that authorities believe the cult threat is not limited to historical incidents, but represents an ongoing security concern. The question of whether any cult members survived their group's final rituals has become a matter of intense speculation among researchers. Several individuals have emerged over the decades claiming to be survivors of various cults, but their accounts are often contradictory and impossible to verify. More disturbing are the reports of individuals who appear to possess knowledge or abilities that could only have been acquired through participation in cult activities, despite having no documented connection to any of the groups. These suspected survivors, if they exist, would represent a unique source of information about cult practices and objectives. However, attempts to locate and interview such individuals have consistently failed, with potential witnesses disappearing or becoming uncooperative when approached by researchers. The pattern suggests either an organized effort to maintain secrecy or the operation of forces that actively prevent the disclosure of cult-related information. The possibility that cult knowledge has been preserved and transmitted through hidden networks adds another layer of concern to an already complex situation. If the techniques and objectives of these groups have survived their apparent destruction, the potential for new cult activities based on the same principles remains a constant threat. The sophisticated nature of the original cult's practices suggests that their knowledge could be used to create even more dangerous organizations with access to modern technology and communication methods. Intelligence analysts have identified several contemporary religious movements that display characteristics similar to the historical Appalachian cults, including unusual recruitment patterns, secretive practices, and claims of supernatural abilities. These groups are subject to ongoing surveillance, but their activities remain within legal boundaries, making direct intervention difficult. The concern is that these organizations might represent the resurgence of cult activity rather than coincidental similarities. The international implications of these discoveries have also attracted attention from foreign intelligence agencies, who are reportedly interested in the potential military applications of cult-derived technologies. The temporal manipulation techniques developed by the Assembly of the 13th Hour, if they could be replicated and controlled, would represent a revolutionary advance in warfare and intelligence gathering. Similarly, the acoustic manipulation methods used by the Congregation of the Hollow Voice could have applications in stealth technology and psychological warfare. This international interest has led to increased security around former cult sites and tighter restrictions on research access. Several foreign researchers who attempted to study the anomalies have been denied entry to the United States, and international academic exchanges related to Appalachian history have been quietly suspended. The message is clear. Whatever these cults discovered is considered too dangerous to share with potential adversaries. The long-term implications of the cult activities extend beyond immediate security concerns to questions about the nature of reality itself. The consistent ability of these groups to achieve effects that violate known scientific principles suggests that our understanding of physics, consciousness, and time may be fundamentally incomplete. The possibility that religious belief and ritual practice can create measurable changes in the physical world challenges the basic assumptions of modern science and raises profound questions about the relationship between mind and matter. These philosophical implications have attracted the attention of researchers in fields ranging from quantum physics to consciousness studies, but their work is hampered by the classified nature of much of the evidence. The few academic papers that have been published on related topics are heavily redacted, and researchers report pressure to avoid certain lines of inquiry that might lead to classified information. The suppression of scientific research into these phenomena represents a significant departure from normal academic freedom, suggesting that authorities view the potential applications of cult-derived knowledge as too dangerous for open investigation. This policy creates a dangerous situation where important discoveries remain hidden from the scientific community, while potentially hostile forces may be pursuing the same research through covert channels. The ethical implications of government secrecy around these incidents also raise troubling questions about the balance between security and transparency in a democratic society. The families of cult victims have been denied information about their loved ones' fate, and communities affected by ongoing anomalies have been left to cope with dangerous conditions without adequate explanation or support. This pattern of secrecy and suppression has created a climate of fear and suspicion in Appalachian communities, where residents report being watched by government agents and warned against discussing certain topics. The psychological impact of living under such surveillance, combined with the stress of dealing with unexplained phenomena, has created lasting trauma that affects entire communities across multiple generations. The legacy of these 9 cults extends far beyond their immediate victims to encompass everyone who has been touched by their ongoing effects. The reality distortions they created continue to spread. The government suppression of information continues to expand, and the questions they raised about the nature of reality remain unanswered. Whether their ultimate goals were achieved through their apparent destruction, or whether their disappearance was simply the beginning of a longer-term plan, remains one of the most disturbing mysteries of American history. What seems certain is that the story of Appalachian cult activity is far from over. The evidence suggests that these groups unlocked forces that continue to operate beyond human understanding or control, creating effects that may persist for generations to come. The question facing researchers, government officials, and affected communities is not whether these forces will continue to manifest, but how humanity will respond when they do. The 9 cults documented in this investigation represent only the known cases of extreme religious activity in the Appalachian region. Government files contain references to dozens of other groups whose activities were so disturbing that all records were destroyed rather than archived. The suggestion that these organizations were part of a larger pattern of occult activity raises the possibility that the true scope of cult influence in American history has been systematically hidden from public view. The mountains themselves seem to remember what happened in those isolated valleys and forgotten hollows. Even today, experienced hikers report an unsettling sensation when passing through certain areas, a feeling of being observed by something that exists just beyond the edge of perception. Local wildlife has never fully returned to many of these locations, creating pockets of unnatural silence that persist decades after the last cult member vanished. Modern technology has revealed disturbing patterns that suggest the cult's influence extended far beyond their immediate geographical boundaries. Satellite thermal imaging shows temperature anomalies that form geometric patterns connecting former cult sites across multiple states. These patterns are invisible to ground-based observation but create clear symbols when viewed from above, suggesting that the group's activities were part of a coordinated effort spanning the entire Appalachian region. The implications of these discoveries have profound consequences for our understanding of American religious history. If these 9 documented cults were part of a larger network of coordinated activity, the possibility exists that similar organizations operated throughout the country, hidden in remote areas where government oversight was minimal and local communities were too isolated to report unusual activities. Recent declassified documents reveal that federal agencies maintained active surveillance of suspected cult activity well into the 1970s, with monitoring stations established throughout the Appalachian region. These installations were officially described as weather monitoring facilities, but their placement corresponds exactly to locations where cult-related anomalies have been reported. The continued operation of these stations suggests that authorities believe the threat of renewed cult activity remains significant. The psychological profiles of cult leaders reveal disturbing similarities that suggest access to advanced manipulation techniques that were decades ahead of their time. Each leader demonstrated sophisticated understanding of group psychology, social conditioning, and behavioral modification that would have been impossible for isolated mountain preachers to develop independently. The source of this knowledge remains unknown, but the consistency across different groups and time periods suggests external training or coordination. Intelligence analysts have identified contemporary religious movements that display characteristics remarkably similar to the historical Appalachian cults. These modern groups employ similar recruitment strategies, maintain secretive practices, and claim supernatural abilities that echo the doctrines of their predecessors. While their activities remain within legal boundaries, the parallels are too significant to ignore, raising concerns about the potential resurgence of cult activity in new forms. The international dimension of these discoveries has attracted attention from foreign intelligence services, who view the potential military applications of cult-derived technologies as strategically significant. The temporal manipulation techniques, acoustic anomalies, and reality distortions created by these groups represent capabilities that could revolutionize warfare, intelligence gathering, and psychological operations if they could be understood and replicated. This foreign interest has led to increased security measures around former cult sites and tighter restrictions on academic research. Several international scholars who attempted to study the anomalies have been denied research permits, and collaborative projects with foreign universities have been quietly suspended. The message is clear. Whatever these cults discovered is considered too sensitive for international sharing. The long-term effects of cult activities continue to manifest in ways that challenge conventional understanding of cause and effect. The temporal distortions created by the assembly of the 13th hour have expanded over the decades, with affected areas now covering nearly 100 square miles. Local residents report increasingly frequent encounters with individuals who appear to be displaced from different time periods, creating a situation that authorities struggle to explain or contain. The acoustic anomalies left by the congregation of the Hollow Voice have similarly evolved, spawning new areas of sound distortion that appear and disappear without warning. The stazoons create dangerous conditions for hikers and hunters who can become trapped in areas where normal communication is impossible. Emergency responders have developed specialized protocols for rescuing individuals from these acoustic dead zones, but the existence of such procedures is not publicly acknowledged. The crystalline remains of the covenant of the undying flame continue to grow and spread through underground networks that follow no known geological patterns. The substance appears to be actively seeking new areas to colonize, extending its influence through water sources and soil systems in ways that suggest a form of consciousness beyond human understanding. Agricultural areas affected by this expansion have produced crops with unusual properties that government agencies quietly monitor and control. These ongoing manifestations have created a climate of fear and uncertainty in Appalachian communities, where residents live with the knowledge that their environment has been permanently altered by forces they cannot comprehend. The psychological impact of dealing with unexplained phenomena, combined with government secrecy and surveillance, has created lasting trauma that affects entire communities across multiple generations. The suppression of information about these incidents represents a significant departure from normal democratic transparency, raising ethical questions about the balance between security and public safety. Communities affected by ongoing anomalies have been left to cope with dangerous conditions without adequate explanation or support, creating a situation where citizens must navigate threats they cannot understand or predict. Local law enforcement agencies have developed informal protocols for handling cult-related incidents, including procedures for managing individuals who claim to be from different time periods and guidelines for investigating disappearances near anomaly zones. These protocols are not officially documented, but their existence suggests that encounters with cult-related phenomena are far more common than public records indicate. The medical community has also quietly developed treatment protocols for individuals affected by exposure to cult-related anomalies. Several hospitals in the region maintain specialized units for treating what they euphemistically call temporal displacement syndrome and acoustic sensitivity disorder. The existence of these facilities is not publicly acknowledged, but their patient records reveal a consistent pattern of symptoms that correspond to the effects described in historical cult accounts. Research into the genetic legacy of cult members has revealed disturbing patterns that suggest hereditary transmission of certain anomalous traits. Descendants of cult members display higher rates of temporal sensitivity, acoustic displacement, and other conditions that appear to be connected to their ancestors' exposure to cult practices. This genetic component adds another layer of complexity to an already difficult situation, suggesting that the effects of cult activities may persist for generations. The implications of these discoveries extend beyond immediate security concerns to fundamental questions about the nature of reality itself. The consistent ability of these groups to achieve effects that violate known scientific principles suggests that our understanding of physics, consciousness, and time may be fundamentally incomplete. The possibility that religious belief and ritual practice can create measurable changes in the physical world challenges the basic assumptions of modern science. These philosophical implications have attracted researchers from fields ranging from quantum physics to consciousness studies, but their work is hampered by the classified nature of much of the evidence. The few academic papers published on related topics are heavily redacted, and researchers report pressure to avoid certain lines of inquiry that might lead to classified information. The question of whether any cult members survived their group's final rituals has become a matter of intense speculation among researchers. Several individuals have emerged over the decades claiming to be survivors of various cults, but their accounts are often contradictory and impossible to verify. More disturbing are reports of individuals who appear to possess knowledge or abilities that could only have been acquired through participation in cult activities, despite having no documented connection to any of the groups. The possibility that cult knowledge has been preserved and transmitted through hidden networks represents a constant threat. If the techniques and objectives of these groups have survived their apparent destruction, the potential for new cult activities based on the same principles remains significant. The sophisticated nature of the original cult's practices suggests that their knowledge could be used to create even more dangerous organizations with access to modern technology and communication methods. What emerges from this investigation is a disturbing picture of coordinated activity that transcended individual cult boundaries and created permanent changes to the physical world. The 9 documented cults represent only the known cases of extreme religious activity in the Appalachian region, with government files containing references to dozens of other groups whose activities were so disturbing that all records were destroyed rather than archived. The evidence suggests that these organizations were part of a larger pattern of occult activity that has been systematically hidden from public view. The consistency of their methods, the sophistication of their techniques, and the persistence of their effects indicate that what happened in those isolated mountain valleys represents something far more significant than isolated incidents of religious extremism. The legacy of these 9 cults continues to shape the Appalachian region today, creating conditions that affect thousands of people who have never heard of the original organizations. The reality distortions they created continue to spread. The government suppression of information continues to expand, and the questions they raised about the nature of reality remain unanswered. Whether their ultimate goals were achieved through their apparent destruction, or whether their disappearance was simply the beginning of a longer-term plan, remains one of the most disturbing mysteries of American history. What seems certain is that the forces they unleashed continue to operate beyond human understanding or control, creating effects that may persist for generations to come. The story of Appalachian cult activity serves as a reminder that in our modern world, where few mysteries remain unsolved and most secrets eventually come to light, there are still places where the old ways never truly ended. Deep in those ancient mountains, where cellular signals die and GPS systems fail, the boundaries between faith and madness, between reality and nightmare, remain as thin as they were a century ago. The mountains remember. In the mist-shrouded hollows where these 9 cults once operated, experienced hunters still report finding artifacts that shouldn't exist, pieces of crystalline material that pulse with their own light, fragments of metal that remain warm to the touch decades after the fires that created them, and books written in languages that linguists cannot identify but somehow feel familiar to anyone who reads them. Local emergency responders have developed unofficial protocols for dealing with what they euphemistically call temporal incidents, situations where hikers become lost in familiar territory because the landscape has somehow changed around them, or where search and rescue teams discover individuals who insist they're from different decades despite carrying identification that proves otherwise. These protocols are not officially documented, but their existence suggests that encounters with cult-related phenomena occur far more frequently than public records indicate. The psychological impact of living in these affected areas has created lasting trauma that extends far beyond the original cult members. Children born in communities near former cult sites display higher rates of what medical professionals quietly classify as environmental sensitivity disorders, conditions that manifest as unusual reactions to changes in light, sound, and temperature that other people cannot perceive. These children often describe hearing voices that adults cannot detect, seeing figures that don't appear in photographs, and experiencing dreams that seem to contain memories of events they never witnessed. Several universities have established discrete research programs to study what they call regional anomaly patterns, but their work is consistently hampered by equipment failures, missing documentation, and the mysterious unavailability of key witnesses. Researchers report that their instruments malfunction in ways that suggest the fundamental constants of physics are unstable in certain areas, and that attempts to document anomalous phenomena often result in recordings that contain sounds and images that weren't present during the actual observations. The government's response to these ongoing manifestations has evolved from simple suppression to active containment. Intelligence agencies now maintain permanent monitoring stations throughout the Appalachian region, officially described as environmental research facilities, but actually designed to track the spread of cult-related anomalies. These installations are staffed by specialists who have been trained to recognize and respond to temporal distortions, acoustic anomalies, and other effects that conventional science cannot adequately explain. Perhaps most disturbing is the evidence that these cults' influence has not remained confined to their original geographical boundaries. Satellite imagery reveals geometric patterns in forest growth and geological formations that connect former cult sites across multiple states, creating a network of influence that spans the entire Appalachian region. These patterns are invisible from ground level, but form clear symbols when viewed from above, suggesting that the group's activities were part of a coordinated effort with implications that extend far beyond their immediate victims. The question that haunts researchers is whether these 9 cults achieved their ultimate goals through their apparent destruction, or whether their disappearance was simply the beginning of a longer-term plan that continues to unfold in ways we cannot yet comprehend. The evidence suggests that whatever these organizations unleashed in those isolated mountain valleys has not been contained, but has instead spread throughout the region like some form of spiritual contagion that affects everyone who comes into contact with it. Modern investigators attempting to study these incidents find themselves facing obstacles that go beyond normal bureaucratic resistance. Documents disappear from archives, witnesses become uncooperative or vanish entirely, and investigation sites become mysteriously inaccessible due to equipment failures, weather conditions, or bureaucratic restrictions that seem to arise without explanation. The pattern suggests that powerful forces remain active in protecting the secrets of these long-vanished organizations. The implications of these discoveries extend far beyond academic curiosity to questions about the nature of reality itself and humanity's place within it. If these 9 documented cults were capable of achieving effects that violate known scientific principles, what does that say about the limitations of our understanding? If religious belief and ritual practice can create measurable changes in the physical world, what other assumptions about the relationship between mind and matter might be fundamentally incorrect? These questions remain unanswered, buried beneath layers of government classification and institutional silence. But in the quiet moments, when the mountain mist settles over those ancient valleys, when the modern world seems suddenly distant and fragile, the evidence of what happened there continues to manifest in ways that remind us that some mysteries refuse to be solved, and some secrets are too dangerous to be fully revealed. The story of these 9 Appalachian cults serves as a warning that in our age of scientific certainty and technological mastery, there remain forces that operate beyond human understanding or control. Whatever these organizations discovered in their isolated mountain strongholds continues to influence the world in ways we are only beginning to comprehend. The mountains keep their secrets, but those secrets have not remained dormant. They continue to shape reality in ways that challenge everything we thought we knew about the boundaries between faith and physics, between belief and truth, between the possible and the impossible. The legacy of these 9 cults persists in the mist-shrouded hollows where they once operated, in the families still affected by their hereditary influence, and in the government agencies that continue to monitor their lingering effects decades after their apparent destruction. Whether their ultimate plan was completed through their disappearance, or whether something even more disturbing awaits in the shadows of those ancient mountains, remains one of the most terrifying mysteries of American history.